Yeah, just to recap on what we have been doing, with the Black Wednesday series, we are trying to fill in a very, important gap in the retelling of the liberation struggle history. And part of what we are trying to establish, in fact, not even trying to establish, but we do establish, is the fact that the 1970s mass movement was a black radical movement. It is a black radical movement that actually developed or erupted, towards the end of the 60s, but was developing into something very profound, throughout the 1970s, right down to the institution of Black Wednesday on the 19th of October, 1977. Now, this is why we argued that Black Wednesday was instituted to deal precisely with this movement. It was meant to undermine the black radical movement that had actually, captured the imagination not only of South Africans, but globally as well. There are images of that, period that we can reflect on. The most popular would be the Hector Peterson, image. Hector Peterson's lifeless body sprawled across Mbuyisa Makobo's arms. That would have been a representation of a kind of victimhood. But there is something else that happened at the same time, which has been taken out of the historical narrative. And that was the brutal killing of Dr. Melville Edelstein. Now, this erasure, of historical facts from the historical narrative is not only happening, without a reason, without a purpose. Often than not, the purpose is to obfuscate, particular aspects of the liberation struggle, simply because they don't go down well with certain powerful interests. Now, the 70s movement, as we know, would have started maybe with the establishment of the South African Students' Movement in '69 and the Black People's Convention in 1972. And thereafter, a whole myriad of political formations, political, cultural, and religious formations actually emerged out of that movement. And part of what we are arguing here is that for that decade, for the 1970s, there had been a kind of a progressive development towards a particular objective. And along the way, there were milestones. Along the way, there were milestones that were refining this movement, defining it and redefining it as we go along. One of the milestones would actually be the Durban moment of 1973. That too would have had the effect of sharpening, people's sensibilities, about the state of affairs in South Africa at the time. But increasingly what was happening here is that the black identity was coming into the fore. The black identity was becoming a kind of an identity that was being forged, and that would define the black race as we went along. Now, then you have the Pro Frelimo rally in 1975. And again here, it is the black mass movement of the period that is able to respond, to the Pro Frelimo rally. It is actually SASO that organizes it. This does not actually go without making any significant impact at all, particularly in that, cohort of black society that would have been the students in high school in the 1970s, particularly, between 1974 and 1976. because it is this cohort that I want us to have a look at today and see to what extent the black radical tradition that had actually been forming, since the end of the 60s and into the 70s, to what extent does it survive? And to what extent does it actually, make an impact that is going to, plunge South Africa into the kind of unrest situation that happened between 1976 and 1977. Understanding how, this development was actually progressing will make us understand, the kind of political consciousness that the activists of this period would have actually internalized. And the point I'm making here is that this was not an overnight, kind of revelation to them. To this cohort that we are going to be looking at, we are looking at, a kind of political development that is going to mature, into a particular political tradition. The issue here is that this political tradition that is going to define this generation is the black radical tradition. And, it actually explodes in Soweto in 1976 on the 16th of June. But leading to that, we have to look into what are the students doing, leading up to this momentous event of the 16th of June. There are already student formations that are beginning to play a role of conscientizing the rest of the students about the state of affairs in South Africa. And at this stage, we have to understand that there is a complete absence of the two major political formations, the ANC and the PAC. And all of this thing is happening in their absence. So when the eruption happens on the 16th of June, it is to be expected, that both the ANC and the PAC would want to claim this. That is to be expected. What is regrettable is the fact that in doing so, they find it necessary to actually surgically, remove the black radical content of this movement and replace that black radical content with a completely different kind of paradigm that is not in any way resonating with what the masses were doing inside the country leading up to 1976. This is important. These two organizations are not interested in the character of the black radical tradition that emerges in their absence. And yet at the same time, they want to lay claim to this movement. And for them to lay claim to this movement, and for that to make sense, this movement will have to have another character other than its true black radical characteristic. That is being taken away from it completely.
Just a word.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're saying, when you say they and say they, it refers to the ANC as well as the PAC.
Yes.
It is all very well and good if you are going to be making these charges vis-a-vis the ANC. I just find it a whole lot more difficult for you to be able to sustain yourself and your contentions, in the specific case of the PAC. How would the PAC be conspiring to obviate the content of black radicalism from the movements within South Africa? Could you explain?
Yes. In fact, I think this is the one issue that we really need to deal with. Over the past 40 years of reflecting on the 1970s mass movement, we have always actually come up, against this kind of, reaction to this statement. Let me hasten to say here that that particular demographic, that cohort, of the mass movement of the 1970s, there is no doubt that the students were at the center of it. And the absence of the ANC and the PAC had a certain effect. we do know, that the PAC was an Africanist movement. And we also do know that we expect that there would be certain ideological and intellectual resonances, between the Black consciousness movement of the 1970s and the Pan-Africanist Congress. We expect that there would be, those kinds of resonances. And we have actually articulated, those resonances and had actually made them clear. That is the one thing. So when I say it is both the ANC and the PAC that are actually responsible for this, this is in relation to where the student movement was in 1976. And to substantiate this, I'm going to go back to an interview, which I have actually quoted so many times that I'm beginning to sound like a broken record. An interview that was done in September 1976 by Tsietsi Mashinini, being interviewed by Dumandlovu about the state of affairs in exile, once Tsietsi had gone over to Botswana. And Tsietsi's statement was this, that the ANC is defunct and the PAC is dead. That's the one thing. That's the one thing that is a historical statement that was made. I'm not saying that statement is absolutely accurate. I'm saying from the point of view of the student movement of the time, they were not making a distinction between the ANC and the PAC. Bear in mind, I am saying there are resonances, between the PAC's, kind of ideological and intellectual, makeup and the Black consciousness movement. I concede to that. But the point I'm making here is that we are talking about the students themselves in 1976, from where Tsietsi Mashinini and the student movement was sitting at the time. Both the ANC and the PAC had to be taken, into criticism, and he did that. Having said that, again, there are few people who are trying to work academically and establish the relationship between the PAC and the Black consciousness movement. And I do believe that people in my circle are people who have been attempting to do that, to forge that link between the PAC and the Black consciousness movement. And we have done that by demonstrating that Steve Biko himself may have been a secret member of POCO. And that is something that we need to develop so that we can then, for once and for all, deal with this kind of perceived difference between Black consciousness and the PAC. And once we have done that, then we will be able to say our criticism is actually leveled at the ANC. Thank you for actually raising it, but we are aware of the of the fact that there are very strong affinities, between the Black consciousness movement and and the PAC. So we are here now at the point at which students are leaving the country after the 4th of August. And this has to do with the fact that Soweto is, staying in Soweto is becoming untenable. It's becoming untenable for a number of reasons, one of which would be that people were getting picked up and taken into custody. And, you never knew whether you had actually committed some kind of a crime or you haven't. So people were wanting to play it safe. But I think we need to have a sense of at what point the majority of young people are leaving South Africa and going into exile. Between the 16th of June and the 4th of August, there isn't much that is happening, except that police are all over in the townships and deaths continue to happen. And the most important thing here is that, as these deaths happen, we have funerals. And funerals were to play a very critical role, once again, in consolidating this kind of an identity, that was being constructed during this period. We went to funerals and, in the process, we were able to not only forge a particular kind of, of paradigm, but also to consolidate it. And if you listen to some of the songs that were being sung, they were actually articulating what would be a distinctly black radical, kind of expression here. Tina sizwe simnyama siyakhala sikhalela izwe lethu elathathwa amabhunu mabayeke izwe lethu. Now, that translates to we are crying, we are a black race, we are crying, we are yearning for our land that was taken away by the Boers. Now, even the labels that we use, the racial categories that we use, are actually evocative. Amabhunu, and it is Boers. And already here,
to be specific, evocative of the colonial encounter, of the colonial conquest.
Exactly, yes.
Precisely. This is what they are referring to.
Yes,
that
precisely,
is
yes.
That was, if you will, the point of reference for political consciousness.
Precisely.
As conceived.
And that actually it becomes the paradigm.
Yes.
The issue here, okay.
So that even subsequent developments, like say capitalism and its, which the left focuses upon, are viewed essentially within the conquest.
Yes.
So it isn't capitalism that creates the society. It is conquest.
It is conquest.
That is
yes.
the conditions of possibility for the capitalist order that subsequently will be established in order to consolidate the conquest.
Yes.
So
yes.
the whole point of capitalism, in as far as people of your political orientation would have been to consolidate the primal fact of conquest.
Precisely.
It's not the other way around.
Yes. And actually to consolidate and deepen racial superiority.
Yes. Make it permanent.
Yes. So what we are having here is, and I was actually giving the time frame, when waves of young people were leaving the country, because this is important. It is important to understand who are these people leaving the country, what political motivations do they have, what shapes their political outlook. We do know that ultimately they are going to join either the ANC or the PAC, but we are particularly interested in what is it that defines them as political activists. And it is my assertion here that at the point at which they cross the border into Botswana, into Lesotho, into Swaziland, they are black nationalists. They are black radicals. What they find on the other side of the border may be something else that they have to deal with. And we are going to show that once they were beyond the border and they fell within the grasp of the ANC and the PAC, that is when that black radicalism is being tampered with. And we are going to show how institutionally and organizationally as well, that work is being done. The work of, with surgical precision, removing the black radical or traces of black radical expressions from these new recruits, of ANC and MK, as well as of the PAC and APLA.
To be sure, they are not political tabula rasa.
Exactly, they are not blank slates upon whom messages of any kind can be written.
Quite.
These are people who will process the messages and decide what to do with them.
Yes, who's that character who was responsible in the ANC for?
I'm coming to that, and that's a very interesting, because it is at that point that it happens. But first, let's see where they actually land. Once they are outside South Africa. And the point I need to make is that the majority of these people go to Botswana because of the, access. Botswana is easily accessible. Lesotho has a problem of being landlocked and therefore less attractive, to these people. And Swaziland also becomes another alternative. But Swaziland actually overtakes Botswana towards the end of October, going into November 1976, precisely because there is a concert of Bob Marley that's going to happen in Swaziland sometime in November. So at that point, there are all roads from Soweto are leading to Swaziland. But among those going to Swaziland, there are those who are doing this with an intention of not coming back to South Africa at the end of the concert. And that actually happens. A lot of the young people who went to Swaziland during this period would have been able to live under the pretext of actually going to that to that concert. So we are looking at a period August to 76 to February 77. That 6 months period when there was a constant flow of young people, not only from Soweto this time, because the unrest had spread to Pretoria, to the East Rand, and to the Vaal. Those areas are also generating young people who are also going to exile. So within that 6 months period, that's when you had a higher volume of people leaving the country. But it is my assertion that when they were doing that at that point, they were actually black nationalists and they were black radicals. Now, what actually happens in that period is that at the same time, camps are being opened in Angola and in Mozambique. So from Lesotho, Botswana, and Swaziland, they are being taken to Mozambique and Angola. And a higher number of them actually go to Angola, to a camp known as Novo Katengwe. And that becomes a very critical camp that's going to play a very critical role in dealing with the black radical tradition in exile. Now, who is at Novo Katengwe? It is Jack Simon. Yes. And Jack Simon is actually former lecturer at UCT and a member of the South African Communist Party. Now, Jack Simon is actually introducing a new paradigm to the new recruits. It is understandable, it is understood by the established formations in exile, that these black radicals, cannot be trusted with the instruments of war if they are still, defined, by the kinds of thought processes that were generated by the 1970s mass movement. They cannot be trusted with those instruments of war. So what had to happen was a very rigorous, educational process that they had to undergo. And Jack Simon and Mark Shorpe were responsible for this. They did, there was routine that the things that they did on a daily basis, but every evening they went for lectures and they would be taught. But what is it that they were being taught? And this is important. What is it that the new recruits who were joining ANC and then going into MK, what were they being taught? They were being deschooled in the first place. The first step was to deschool them completely of the black radical, predisposition that they would have had, going into exile. That had to be dealt with and dealt with effectively. And Jack Simon was working on that. Now, once they were sure that was done, the idea would have been to introduce a new kind of understanding of the liberation struggle in South Africa. And this is what Tate was explaining earlier on. This is where capitalism as a site of struggle actually enters the equation and enters the narrative. But, we know that this is obfuscatory. This is merely to mask what the decisive antagonism should be. In terms of what these young people were understanding, the decisive antagonism was race. The struggle was against racial supremacy. But be that as it may, these guys go through, that kind of educational process, going through, going into 1977. By June 1977, the first of these young men, or the first group of them, is ready to be redeployed back into the country. And this is the test. This is a test of whether they really understood what Jack Simon was actually, imparting to them. And this time they have those instruments of violence, given to them. And it means they were trusted, to understand the complexities, of exploitation and oppression. They had to understand that very carefully. And I'm sure that, the ANC leadership and MK leadership were confident that these guys did understand. Now, the first three of these is the most popular trio, in this narrative. And that would be Monty Mutloung, Solomon Masango, and Lucky Masango. That's the first three who re-entered the country after 1976. And theirs is the Goch Street shooting. That happens in downtown Johannesburg on the 13th of June, 1976. And this is 3 days before the first anniversary of the June 16th, unrest of the previous year. And these guys are entering the country, they are armed, and it is unclear what they are going to do. But quite clearly, they have already been deschooled of the black radical, kind of impulses that could have, driven them. And they're supposed to do what is right. And what is right is not to harm civilians. And we have to be clear about this. This is absolutely critical. Whatever these guys are going to do, the instruction is that they must never bring violence to civilians. But let's talk about who civilians are. Civilians is not everybody in South Africa in 1977. There are no black civilians at all. Blacks are township dwellers, or they are hostel inmates, or they are subjects of traditional authorities in the Bantustans, or they are not even labor tenants, but they are serfs in white commercial agriculture. That's the totality of blackness, during this period. So there are no black civilians. And when the ANC's language says, do not bring violence to civilians, what it means, do not harm white people. Whatever you do, don't bring violence to white people. Now, here are these three guys armed with AK-47, with Makarov pistols, a couple of landmines, and this is dangerous. And as they go into a taxi, a policeman says, hey, what's in the bag? Now, that's when all hell breaks loose. Lucky Masango disappeared, and he disappeared and nobody knows what happened. He disappeared completely. He was never seen. He ran away. Monty Mutloung and Solomon Masango went in an opposite direction. And as they were running down the street, a policeman coming after them and saying, stop. Two white people thought, well, here's a black man coming. He probably has snatched a handbag from a white woman. And they thought they would stop them. But this is important. It is Monty Mutloung who fired 2 shots and killed the 2 white civilians instantly. Now, the impact of that, particularly among black bystanders, it told them that this is no ordinary robbery. This is something much bigger than this. And white people were, definitely, that actually had a massive impact. The long and the short of it is that both these guys surrendered and they were taken into custody. It is possible that police, collected statements from bystanders who fingered Monty Mutloung as the shooter. His interrogators must have been so crazed, so outraged by what he did, that they beat Monty Mutloung to a pulp, and he became brain damaged. And therefore he couldn't stand trial. So it is Solomon Masango who stood trial. Now here is something that South Africans have to deal with. It is not Solomon Masango who fired the shots that killed the civilians. It is Monty Mutloung who killed the 2 white civilians. But Monty could not stand trial because he was brain damaged. So it is only Solomon who stood trial. And Solomon was actually charged with the murders of the 2 white civilians, even though it was known that he wasn't responsible. And when his defense said, but he didn't pull the trigger, they said, yes, we know, he didn't. But he had a common purpose with Monty Mutlo. And on the basis of the principle of common purpose, which wasn't so much a part of South African law as it was a part of British law. In fact, the British legal system instituted the principle of common purpose to deal with the Irish Republican Army. And the South African legal system merely imported it to deal with the Solomon Mahlangu matter. And that's how they dealt with it. Solomon was found guilty, sentenced to death, and was executed on the 6th of April.
Could you, was Solomon, though, of the disposition to have pulled out a gun and shot a white man? He evidently did not. No gun was drawn from him.
Yes, in actual fact, and this is where a lot of the details about what actually happens in that particular moment. There's a great deal of, of doctoring the evidence here, but it is clear, from all eyewitness accounts that yes, Solomon Mahlangu did not, in fact, even draw a firearm. It is Monty who did.
So ultimately, Simon's ideological reconditioning exercises were more effective in the case of Solomon rather than Monty.
We attempted to say that, and all the evidence would point to that. All the evidence would point to the fact that, in actual fact, Solomon Mahlangu proved to be, a true, dedicated cadre of the movement, disciplined, and following party discipline. That may well be the case. But Monty may be something else here. We need to explain Monty's reaction at this stage. And there is a tendency to want to say it was impulsive, it wasn't thought through. But we don't know that. It may well be that Monty did this consciously and deliberately. And it is precisely for this reason that Monty is being taken out of the historical narrative. Now, let's actually zero in on that.
So the hopes of one such as Simon's would have been that she would be able, through a discourse or logic, even blot out the impulse derived from the reality, the actual lived existential reality of conquest and racial subjugation and subjection.
Yeah.
So move a little coordinates in the cogito, in the cognitive aspect of somebody.
Yeah.
And you then somehow hope to ultimately impact upon the very source of their impulses and motivation for living their lives. That's a gamble.
Yes,
Under any.
You reckon it's a gamble that he took?
Indeed, time and time again, isn't it?
Yes,
it is proven by the fact that it failed over and over.
It failed over and over and over again.
Yes, so,
and each time it failed, there had to be, volumes and volumes of explanations of why it failed. But yeah, you're right. Yeah.
I hope I haven't interrupted you.
No, in fact, no. I think it is. No, that was quite a useful.
Kindly carry on if you can remember.
Yeah, you would.
You kindly carry on.
Yeah, no, I remember now that we are now looking at what happens after the Solomon matter. We've taken it up to the point where he gets executed, but that also is still, a very thick, kind of theme that still needs to be unpacked. The actual execution itself, that also is quite significant.
The role of Fatima Mie.
Yes. All of that too needs to be dealt with. But let's go back to now that they have been sent, and this has actually happened. What happens back in, in the camps?
Yes.
In Angola, in Zambia. In actual fact, the ANC is called upon to explain the death of the two civilians, in the Goch Street shooting, they are called upon to explain whether this is actually the policy of the movement, because that is actually being seen as a terrorist attack. And because of that label, this Monty's, killing of the two civilians assumes greater significance, because it is then being seen as a deliberate and conscious attack, motivated by terroristic, kinds of impulses. And that's what the ANC had to deal with, to clean it up. And how do they do this? They actually take Monty out of the equation completely. And the Goch Street shooting becomes about Solomon Mahlangu. But even as it is about Solomon Mahlangu, it is not about him killing the two civilians. The ANC very rarely makes reference to Solomon killing two white people. In fact, it is interesting that Solomon is only seen to have carried out the act in the 1980s. It is the next generation that sings songs about Solomon Mahlangu, as if he was Monty Mutlo.
This is the Solomon they would imagine, they would much rather imagine was the reality.
Yes, yeah. But if they were to credit Monty with this, they wouldn't be able to get rid of or deal with the black radical impulses in the way they may have wanted to. That is why Monty had to be taken out of the historical narrative completely. Let's go back to what happens in Angola. 3 months after this, 3 months after Monty and Solomon had been taken in, something happens at Novo Katengwe on the 5th of September 1976. That's where we are. 1977, actually, sorry. On the 6th of September 1977, yes, 3 months after Solomon and Monty were captured. Again, normal routine that the cadres in the camp, would have gone through on that day, the 5th. And then late at night, they went and had their meals before they would go to lectures. But soon after they had their meals, everyone wanted to rush to the loo. And it became clear that there was some kind of food poisoning. But later in the night, some historians give statistics of 9 out of 10 of the 500 cadres that were at Novo Katengwe were affected by the food poisoning. They were actually assisted by the Cuban doctors who were in a nearby camp. And they came in and, were able to, deal with this food poisoning, and everybody actually recovered. Now, once everybody had recovered, the leadership decided that this was the work of informers, that these were apartheid spies that were planted inside the movement, and they were responsible for this food poisoning. And these apartheid spies had to be identified, and this is the interesting part of it. And again here, we are seeing yet another assault, a systematic assault on black radicalism is taking place here. John Nkadime, who is a very senior member, of the SACP and SACTU, as well as in the ANC, decided that it is the new recruits of the black consciousness movement who are apartheid spies inside MK, who are responsible for the food poisoning. And what happens immediately thereafter is that investigations are immediately instituted to find out who among these black radicals, is actually an apartheid spy. These investigations lasted, from 1977 right down to 1980. And along the way, people were being identified as the culprits. The first one who was actually identified, and I'll just mention, his name only, Derek Lubelo, was said to be, the man at the center. And after some serious interrogation, Derek confessed and pointed to 4 other people. By the end of 1977, 64 people had been fingered as having been responsible, for the food poisoning.
The vast portion of whom I imagine would have been black radicals.
In fact, as John Nkadimeng said, the investigation actually centered around the new recruits who were black consciousness generated by the 1970s movement. It is them who are being seen, as being sellouts. But credit to Jack Simon. Jack Simon is the only one who commented and said, guys, this is wrong. This is poor handling, of the foodstuffs that came from, and food actually came from all kinds of sources, from the Soviet Union, from Sweden, from all over the place. It could have been any of those could have been the source of that food poisoning. And it is only Jack Simon who, who refuted the claim that it was the black radicals that were responsible for it. Now, the point here is that in that 3-year period, 64 people had been fingered, as having been responsible, and they were going to have to be dealt with. Now, by 79, 80, that is when it appeared that, ultimately this was going to happen. But early in, during 1980, there were consultations that took place with the leadership showing some kind of preparedness to talk to the rank and file. And there were a number of, sessions that were held until the end of 1980. And there were indications that there will be more consultations early in 1981, to smooth whatever, grievances that the rank and file may have had. But going into 1981, something happened. Very early in January 1981.
Just before it would appear to me, just me commenting on this, that between Nkadimeng and Jack Simons, it is pretty clear this was all an expression, of course, of the ideological conflicts that were occurring within the ANC. The new recruits, black consciousness, black radical-oriented new recruits, and these attempts to treat them as a tabula rasa and reschedule like an entirely different ideological script unto them. This year was an outgrowth of these conflicts, these antagonisms that were marking the organization at this period of time. The more realistic of these people, it's clear Jack Simons, for his part, was confident in his ability to carry through the task of ideological containment on purely intellectual, cognitive grounds. That would have sufficed as far as is concerned. Nkadimeng, on the other hand, was not so sure.
No, certainly not.
So hence felt these measures here would have been necessary.
And the one thing that we have to make clear that to the viewers is that the transition that you are talking about here is extremely taxing if you think about it. The Marxist-Leninist theory of revolution is such an esoteric undertaking. By esoteric, I actually mean it is only intelligible to those who have been exposed, to the kind of literature that it is all about. And you do not expect, anyone to be able to relate to that sort of thing. In fact, it is the sort of thing that happens in lecture theaters. You teach that at undergraduate. It's an undergraduate kind of thing, or probably even postgraduate. And it is not expected that within, a wink of an eye, you can easily remove, completely erase, those black radical impulses and replace that, with Marxist-Leninist kind of, social revolutionary theory.
Hence Nkadimeng was more realistic.
Yes, Nkadimeng would have been more realistic.
Physical expansion of these people.
Exactly. But then they give you an example of a very, a competent student who came out of the Jack Simon class.
Yes.
And this is a student that is particularly interesting to us, and that is Tamizulu. And we are going to talk about Tamizulu somewhere down the line. But part of what we are trying to show here, is that the black radical tradition may be non-existent in South Africa today, but we want to explain, how step by step this tradition was subjected to a systematic assault. Not because it's most certainly, the apartheid state would have wanted to deal with it. So it would have invested a great deal of intellectual and even human resources, in dealing with the black radical tradition. And they did that with Black Wednesday on the 19th of October, 1977.
Would have wanted to deal with it, to be sure, because it directly threatened the settler colonial process.
Precisely, yes, yes. Precisely,
yes.
Precisely because of, they could tolerate, the Rooi Gevaar, rather than the Swart Gevaar. And this is a comparison between the Swart Gevaar and the Rooi Gevaar.
But just anticipating what you are driving to is that, in fact, the left as well, and the Marxian tradition, the white Marxist tradition in South Africa as well, would have wanted to deal with this.
They did. And they did. And we are going to show how they do that.
And the point really is that it is for the very same reasons.
Yes, yes. In fact, we are going to show much later, not today maybe, but in later episodes, we are going to show how the white left inside South Africa would be doing the same thing that the Enk external mission was actually doing in exile. And quite clearly, the PAC is not doing this. And again, it goes back to the PAC is not erasing black radicalism
Because
from
it
its
itself is from black radicalism.
Yeah, but we still need to establish this, with an intellectual kind of rigor, the link, between black consciousness and the Pan-Africanist Congress. It cannot be taken for granted that it exists. It has to be shown. It has to be demonstrated.
Our brother, Doc, is it Dr. Thando Langa?
Yes,
I
yes,
think
yeah.
In a recent
Yes, and he's doing a pretty good job
Man is
establishing
the
that
bigger
link.
problem. Right.
Now, in January 1981, we've just talked about the investigations that went on, for 3 years from September 1977 right down to December 1980. Going into 1981, something happened, and again here we are accounting for what is happening to the black radical tradition, both in terms of that as an intellectual paradigm, but also looking at the activists, who were carriers of this black radical tradition. So in January 1981, the South African Defense Force goes into Mozambique, into Matola, and they raid Matola, and they kill 12 cadres of the Enk, and mostly the June 16 detachment, because it was them that were in the safe houses. Again, this is, following up on the black radical activists within the Enk, and 12 of them, are taken out by the SADF. And after the raid, it becomes clear that the SADF, did this with such precision. They had to have prior information about where they were going and what they were going to do. And again, there was suspicion that we were sold out. And again, it is the guys from the Black Consciousness Movement who are responsible for selling us out once again, for giving the intel to SADF. So another investigations got started.
In the Angola case, the food poisoning case, who was getting sold out to? Who were the people? Who had they sold out to? I mean, what was the perception? Was it the Boers that were behind this food poisoning? Was it the Boers that were perceived
Yes,
to be
in actual
behind
fact,
the food poisoning? It was
yes,
Boss. It was
yes.
perceived to be a
In
Boss
fact,
operation.
in fact, Derek Lubelo
Right.
said he had the poison given to him by his handler.
In Boss.
Yes. Oh, you're saying boss? Yes, it was boss. It was the Bureau of State Security for sure. You know, that is the Angst narrative. The Angst narrative is that these spies were working with the Bureau of State Security. You know, they were boss agents, actually. So this, again, this comes up after the Matola raid, that in actual fact, this was a kind of an infiltration, of the Ang. Again, and it's not individuals. It is by people coming out of the Black consciousness movement that are responsible for this. And yet again, the investigations begin, and they go on and on and on.
This is now in regard to
In
Matola.
81,
This is, yes.
after the
Who's making
Matola.
the charge this time? Is it Nkadimeng still? Who's making the charge in 81 against?
Yes,
Is it
it's
still
a
Nkadimeng?
continuation of that charge.
So Nkadimeng made the charge against Black consciousness
In 77.
77 as well as in 81.
As well as in 81, yes. In fact, in 81, the other people who actually come out to the fore, one of them is actually Moses Mabhida. Moses Mabhida makes some very seriously threatening statements. Statements like, death to all the dacha smokers.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Right. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
But the long and the short of it is that the Matola raid merely continues. It enables them to continue along this line. So part of what we have to come to terms with here is that the 1970s movement generated a whole cohort, of young people who were going to energize, who were going to energize the ANC and the PAC in exile. But unfortunately, particularly the ANC, this is what the ANC actually did to such a critical resource, that landed on their lap. And again, these investigations went on for a while. Now, for 2 years, it appeared that there was absolutely nothing happening between the Matola raid and August 1983. It appeared nothing was happening, but in fact, something was happening. Investigations were going on. They still wanted to, pin down the people responsible.
Yes.
Yeah.
When are the MK, Mkhonto is a military police, the Mbogoto, formed? When are they constituted? And really in response to what imperatives?
In response to this,
Right. Could you give us a sense of the time?
in response to the perception that the ANC has been infiltrated. At what point would the ANC suspect of being infiltrated? If you think about it, before 1976, why would they think they were being infiltrated? The people in the camps before 1976 were the old guard who left the country in 1960. By 1975, the ANC could claim that we have sanitized the movement of all impurities. And the impurities would have included the Gang of Eight. With the Gang of Eight out of the way, the ANC was confident that it had nothing, it didn't have to look over their shoulder until the Black consciousness movement generated a new cohort for them. And it is this cohort that is being seen as infiltrating the ANC on behalf of, of the apartheid state. And it is at that point that this security...
even though the ANC could convince itself that the black consciousness was no more than an arm of the apartheid state and settler colonialism itself, it couldn't really sustain these positions in fora such as the African Liberation Committee,
Yes,
or the Organization of African Unity, or for that matter, the United Nations.
But and also, how would the others? I mean, if you think about of all people, how would Machel have responded to this? Yes. Machel may not have made any public statements, but surely this would have had, quite, a worrying effect, on him. That sort of thing actually happening. But the issue here is that during that period, Matola and August 1983, as I say, there was still a pursuit of those that were seen as sellouts. And in the end, the cadres were saying, but wait a minute, we want to go home and fight. And that's when this demand was being made. And it was actually becoming even more...
This is the cadres the cadres
this is during 1983, yes. August, towards August 1983, since Matola.
You're referencing the Vienna uprising in that.
We are not at the Vienna uprising yet. Okay, right. This is August 1983. And what is happening, according to the testimonies of some of the cadres, is that they were being shunted from one safe house to another without being deployed back inside the country. So in August 1983, they were making this demand that they want to go back. And believe it or not, but the leadership decided to take an entire battalion of MK cadres and send them to the war front to assist MPLA against UNITA. Yes. And this went on from August until December. When these guys came back to camp in December 1983, a couple of things had happened. A group of them were, just as an example, a group of them returned to Angola and they were saying there was a time when for 3 days they couldn't get anything to eat. That was one of the complaints. Another was the fact that it appeared that the communities in Angola were more favorable to UNITA than they were to MPLA. They actually found some of the communities more hostile, to them. And this was in December 1983, when they were making, these kinds of claims. And they wanted to see the leadership. They demanded to see the leadership. And that is what leads us to the Vienna uprising. It leads to the Vienna uprising. Yeah.